It's my pleasure, my considerable pleasure, today to introduce Dr. John Rusa, who is now an associate professor of history at the University of British Columbia. Why it's not just professor of history? Well, maybe that's going to be addressed in the near future. Hopefully it'll be taken care of. John is, of course, well known to many of us here at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, or should I say, here at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies of a certain generation. While completing his doctorate in South Asian history in Madison, that wasn't a slip of the tongue, South Asian history here at Madison. John served as editor of our publications program, and among his many contributions, he transformed Pierre Brochu's dissertation on the Mekong Delta into an elegant English translation, a work that's now read in many of our courses on Southeast Asia on this campus. As a student in the history PhD program, John also completed a minor in Southeast Asian history, focusing generally on the socioeconomic history of the archipelago. After finishing an outstanding doctoral dissertation on the social history of Hyderabad, India in 1998, John held a year-long postdoctoral fellowship at Caltech in 1999 before leaving for Jakarta, where he spent 2 years working as an independent scholar on an oral history of the victims of the 1965 repression. Now, you notice I use that academic euphemism, independent scholar. That's a word for those of us that don't have a job. And I think it's going to be a label attached to a growing number of our graduates from these programs. So it wasn't a great moment in his career. In one of his first publications on the Indonesian military, John drew upon this research to publish an article in the 2001 issue of the premier journal Indonesia, analyzing documents that the Indonesian army left behind during their hasty withdrawal from East Timor. And through the slow, painful archival digging that is the historian's trade and craft, John also came across something called the Suparjo document after weeks of plowing through thousands of pages in Jakarta's military archives. Following the abortive September 1965 coup in Jakarta, Brigadier General Suparjo wrote a detailed internal analysis of the factors underlying the failure of the coup attempt by a group called the September 30th Movement that became an exhibit in his 1967 treason trial and a reason for his execution in 1970. For years, the Suparjo document, with all its surprising revelations about these controversial events, lay buried in the mass of trial transcripts until John dug it out and began reflecting on its implications for our understanding of these traumatic events. Drawing upon this and similarly revealing documents, John launched what became a path-breaking inquiry into Indonesia's 1965 coup that ended President Sukarno's rule and precipitated the massacre of somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million suspected communists. One of the most controversial, traumatic, and least understood incidents in the 40 years of the Cold War. Now, when I was writing these notes last night, and I was thinking about this, like all historians, I see reality in the rearview mirror, and I look back on what John was doing, and in retrospect, it seems kind of, foolhardy, absolutely foolhardy, and foolhardy not just in a little way, but foolhardy in the extreme. Imagine an unemployed scholar of Indian history deciding to do what nobody can do. You just can't do this. You switch fields, okay? And you do so, you switch to Southeast Asia, and you do this by undertaking a study of the most secret, sensitive, and controversial topic in the Southeast Asia field, a traumatic coup cum massacre that for a time damaged the reputation of the great scholar Benedict Anderson and completely destroyed the emotional equilibrium and the career of one of my own graduate cohort at Yale, who emerged from studying and interviewing people about this massacre in East Java. Yet, somehow John persevered, winning a tenure track appointment at the University of British Columbia in 2004, while launching himself headlong into the intellectual and political maelstrom of the 1965 Jakarta coup, somehow maintaining his emotional equilibrium for the 20 years needed to produce not one, but two pioneering scholarly monographs that stand as nothing less than testimony to the analytic power of the historical method in the hands of a skilled scholar. In his first path-breaking book on this topic, Pretext for Mass Murder, published by our Center series at the University of Wisconsin Press back in 2006, John cut through all of the competing, confusing claims that had clouded these events for the preceding 40 years and offered what is now considered by partisans on all sides of the events as the most penetrating and balanced analysis of these events. In the 2 decades since the publication of that monograph, every serious discussion of these traumatic events by scholars or journalists begins with John's now classic study. For the past 10 years, some of this country's most talented filmmakers and investigative reporters have returned to these tragic events in an attempt to answer one of the greatest mysteries of the Cold War: what actually happened in Jakarta in September and October of 1965. Whether it's the brilliant filmmaker Joshua Oppenheimer in his disturbing film The Act of Killing, or the respected investigative reporter Vincent Bevins in his book The Jakarta Method, all turn to John's work as the foundation for their own inquiries. After conducting hundreds of interviews with survivors of these traumatic events and collecting just about every extant document on the months of massacre that followed the 1965 coup, John has published a second path-breaking book on this subject with the University of Wisconsin Press in 2020, titled Buried Histories, the Anti-Communist Massacres of 1965-66 in Indonesia. Now, if you haven't read these works, I commend them to your attention, not so much for what they tell us about events that, like all events, are fading into the past, or half century ago in Indonesia, but to read them as an exemplar, a telling exemplar, a revealing exemplar of how history can uncover the truth of even the most traumatic past. Now, simultaneous with this dense empirical work found in these 2 books, John has also been working to place these events in a comparative analytical context, leading him to today's talk, which is titled The 1965-66 Massacres in Indonesia Within the Frame of Genocide Studies, What is Gained and What is Lost. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Al, and thanks, Mary, and to all of you for coming. I hadn't planned on making any remarks of the remarks that I'm going to make, but given Al's introduction, I'll make a couple. One is that if you are an independent scholar, you can use that time productively. That is, I use that time to conduct interviews and work with a large number of Indonesian researchers and volunteers. And we did a lot. And it's precisely in those years that I was not gainfully employed that I was able to do much more than if I was when I had a job. And indeed, when you have a job, it's not just the obligations of the job, but all of these requirements to fulfill to conduct oral history. At that time, we were able to design it ourselves, and we were able to interview many people all around Indonesia. And the other thing is that there's an advantage of coming at a topic from the outside and not having these kinds of investments in sort of who's saying what and what are the politics of saying things and what are other people going to think about that and so forth. And there's an advantage of this outsider just coming in. And as Al mentioned, when the Pretext for Mass Murder was published in 2006, in Indonesian studies I was a nobody. And all of a sudden I was talking about sort of this important event. And I didn't actually realize a lot of the implications of that. You know, I didn't realize how people are going to read it and what kind of responses. I just did it, and you know, it worked out okay. So those are, for those of you in grad school now, that is something to consider. Just don't be scared about, you know, sort of, wow, this is a big topic, and you know, just be naive. Just be ready. A lot of times, people have set ideas, and it requires somebody from outside to come in with a new lens, different eyes. So just some things to think about for those of you in grad school now. So, and it is, I'm really delighted to be here. It's been 20 years since I was here, and I think it was in this room, a Friday forum, where I spoke initially about this, my sort of preliminary analysis of the September 30th movement, to borrow a title of a famous work on it. And that ultimately became Pretext, and it was having the advantage of this kind of forum that I was able to then prepare the book manuscript. So, and I'm really grateful for Al's supervision of my study of Southeast Asia. I took a directed study with him one term. He might not even remember that, but it was, as a professor now, supervising graduate students, I realized the kind of time it takes. And when I was a very snarky graduate student, I sort of took professors' time for granted. And I don't do that now. I'm grateful very much for the time that Al spent on listening to my discussions of the readings that I was doing about Indonesian history. It's been very, just in the morning that I've been here and walking around, it's been so nostalgic to see all of these buildings and to meet all of you who I've known for so long. So this, the book Buried Histories, I began working on really at the start in 2000 when you and I and other researchers conducted oral interviews. And we were interviewing ex-political prisoners by and large. And all of them had stories about other prisoners being taken out and massacred. But that's all they knew. They knew that other people had been taken out, but they didn't know where they had been massacred. And it's taken me this long to come to an analysis of the massacres themselves, because they were conducted in such a way as to eliminate the historical evidence. They were meant so that they could not be written about. And it was much easier to write about the September 30th movement because there was so much about that, and everybody had weighed in on that, and many of the participants had written memoirs and so forth. And there was a lot of information to sort of cross-check and compare and so forth. And I would emphasize the point that Al made, that just simple historical strategies of critical evaluation of the sources is still really important, and being able to venture truth claims rather than just saying somebody said this, somebody said that, and this is the narrative constructs involved. In some ways, I feel like a old kind of empiricist historian. I really am trying to figure out what happened in a really naive, stupid way. But at the same time, I'm sort of cognizant of all of the complications. And I had a colleague look at Pretext for Mass Murder, just the table of contents, and said, "This is postmodern." I said, "No, it really isn't." But it is based upon a really old-fashioned kind of history. I will admit that, but that is still really valuable, I think. So I began the book, Buried Histories, with a story about Ibru Santoro, who was a graduate student here in Madison studying economics from 1959 to about 1964 or early 65. I'm not quite sure when he left. He was a student of L. Reed Tripp, who had run a Ford Foundation program in Yogyakarta in the late 1950s. And L. Reed Tripp then recruited Ibru Santoro from Jogja and brought him here. He saw Ibru Santoro as a really bright, promising young intellectual, very active and committed. And this is a photo from L. Reed Tripp's son, John Tripp, who I was put in touch with by a fortuitous circumstance. That is, a colleague of mine at UBC in the history department, he's emeritus now, Arthur Ray, mentioned that when he was a graduate student here at UW, he knew a number of Indonesian students. And I said, do you happen to know Ibru Santoro? And he said, yeah, I do. But you know, I'm still in touch with the Tripp family. And here's his email address. Here's John Tripp's email address. And so I learned from John Tripp then much more about Ibru Santoro, because Ibru Santoro really made an impact on the family of L. Reed Tripp. And they were, John Tripp mentioned that John Tripp's the son of L. Reed Tripp, mentioned that he was kind of an adopted member of the family because he was so outgoing and extroverted and gregarious. And this is a photo of him, I think, at the Memorial Union. There was an international fair held every year where people from different countries would present kind of information. This is in the early 1960s at some point. And so there's batik cloth and paintings and wood carvings and a map to say this is Indonesia. And this is, and you notice he was very good looking. And John Tripp mentioned that a woman in front of the Memorial Union once ran into him and said, "You look like JFK." And he was just very charismatic. So Ibru Santoro was arrested in Yogyakarta when he, in late 1965. It turns out he didn't finish his PhD because of the breakdown in relations between Sukarno's Indonesia and the US in 64, 65. His scholarship and the program was ended and he had to return. This was at the time Indonesia was kicking out the Peace Corps and US Information Service. So it's in that context. His studies were cut short, and that's why there unfortunately isn't a PhD left here that was written by Ibru Santoro. And so after he was arrested in late 1965, he disappeared from the place of detention. In March 1966, his family were delivering food to him. His family was delivering food to him on a regular basis, and that's the way the prisoners survived, because they never would have survived on the basis of what the prisons gave them. So, but then one day, the family comes to make the delivery, and they're told he's no longer there, and they don't know where he is, and he's just been transferred. So after that, they never knew what had happened to him. It was only in 1999, after the fall of Suharto, that these ex-political prisoners started organizing, because they were concerned about trying to figure out what happened to all those people who were taken out of prison. They saw the people taken out of prison, people they knew. Sometimes they knew only briefly in prison, other times they were old family friends or comrades within the struggle. And they were just disappeared. And so they wanted to find out what had happened to them. Victims started to organize. And this organization called YPKP, this Yayasan Penelitian Korban Pembunuhan 65, was working with another NGO to excavate a mass grave. And they had a number of different possibilities, but they chose one mass grave in Wonosobo. And this is the Ibru Santoro's younger brother speaking about it in this film, Shadowplay, which is where I first learned about Ibru Santoro and his connection with University of Wisconsin. So the massacre was one that happened to claim Ibru Santoro. And in the film, they describe the exhumation and then also how the massacre was, how it happened. And the only reason they were able to document it was because there was one document that was written by or preserved by a guard. I think it was written by one of the prisoners there on their trip from Yogyakarta to Wonosobo. And it had a list of names of people in the truck who had been taken from Yogyakarta. And a guard happened to keep it. And then after 1998, after Suharto fell, and these ex-political prisoners were looking around for information about the massacres, this document surfaced. And so they knew the names of people who had been killed, and Ibru Santoro was one of them. And they knew the location. They had precise information about the location, which was on a hillside in a very sort of remote part of remote area of central Java. It was otherwise completely unmarked. It was only the recollection of another eyewitness, where they were able to locate it. And so, given the documentation that they had, given the information they had on this one incident, they chose this mass grave to exhume. And this is really the only mass grave that has been exhumed with this kind of attention to the forensics of it. And even then, it was a kind of rushed job. It was difficult just to organize this. This was only possible in those early years after the Suharto fell, when the military was kind of in disarray and there was some openness for this. The organization was attacked actually a little while later when they tried to rebury the remains. This was a very fragile situation, and so it's remarkable that the exhumation was even able to take place. And in the exhumation, they were able to find the skeleton of Ibru Santoro. They were able to identify, and the family was able to identify it and rebury him in their ancestral plot in Yogyakarta. I opened the book Buried Histories with this story in order to indicate that these victims of the massacres that we call communists included people who a North American audience would know about, would be able to identify with. Somebody that was from here in Madison, just about 30 years before I was here. So in the book, I don't get into whether or not Ibru Santoro was a member of the Communist Party. I sort of leave that open. I don't really know what his political convictions were. I don't know why he was chosen to be killed. It would seem kind of just counterintuitive for somebody who had just come back from the US on a Ford Foundation funded program to be considered a communist and killed. But in 2019, I met a couple ex-political prisoners in Yogyakarta who knew him and knew his family. And they said the family was actually, the father had been a supporter of the Communist Party in the 1920s. And one of them thought that he had actually been sent to Deagle, the prison camp where the Dutch colonial government sent communists in the late 1920s and held them there in the 1930s. And I don't know if that's the case, but there's that. He was also an Islamic scholar, the father. He was an ulama. And it was at that generation, the 1920s, of this combination of Islam and communism. So Ibru Santoro was coming out of that background, and he was also a member of the HSI, the Himpunan Sarjana Indonesia, the organization of scholars affiliated with the PKI. And the family in the film, the younger brother, said that he had joined or he had supported this PKI-affiliated students organization out of a kind of opportunism so that his job could be secure at this university in Yogyakarta, Universitas Gadjah Mada. I don't know if that's actually the case. I think it was more just he's from this background of a left family, but it indicates something about the nature of the left in Indonesia at the time, the prioritization of Indonesian nationalism, that the communism was very much a nationalist movement, and it was meant for sort of, it was a populism. It was meant for the broader people, for workers and peasants. And it was intellectually quite open, and so somebody like Ibru Santoro could be here and learn from this, from the United States, from a U.S. university. And if you think about it, if he had survived, he would have been a rival to the Berkeley Mafia. The Berkeley Mafia were, quote-unquote mafia, were Indonesians who had been trained in economics by the Ford Foundation also at the University of California, Berkeley. Elreed Tripp was in the same program, but he was training Ibru Santoro from a left background, and we don't know why he was killed, but certainly his killing eliminated somebody who would have been a leader, who would have been at the level of the Berkeley Mafia that collaborated with the Suharto regime. So, in all of my work, I'm constantly thinking about what would Indonesia look like if the mass murder had not happened. The number of artists who were killed, the number of intellectuals, the number of just really good community organizers, it's just the potential there. Indonesia would look very different now. And I think we constantly need to remember about the lost possibilities of Indonesia's trajectory as a nation state. So my book this Buried Histories is about the massacres, and I partly make the argument, or I illustrate the argument, or I get the reader to visually understand the argument through a couple paintings, and this is on the cover, and this is from a ex-political prisoner who's still alive, Joko Piket. He's in Jogja now, and he saw fellow prisoners being taken out. And the emphasis here is on the trucks in the middle. So these were, he's emphasizing how the massacres took place. It's much like in Wonosobo. They were put on a truck, taken from Yogyakarta, someplace outside the city. And there's other mass graves that they found, but have not been exhumed, all ringing Yogyakarta. So this image of the trucks with people on the back, of captives, blindfolded, that's what I want to stick with the reader. Because this is the kind of killing that I think was the most common form of killing. This is how you have such a very large death toll, with numbers that we don't even know. We have no idea how many people, hundreds of thousands killed, but we have no idea how many. But that, because we often have this idea that, and indeed when I started the research, I did not understand how the killings occurred, and how, whether there's villagers just attacking other villagers, that was the line that you often heard before, or these anti-communist civilians, the religious organizations, or the other political parties attacking the PKI. It's just, where in this spectrum of violence did these massacres lie? I didn't really know. It was only after years of collecting more information from different parts of Indonesia that I was able to come up with this statement, and why I'm able to venture this claim. Again, it's a truth claim. It's a claim about the truth of what happened. And it might be naive to attempt that. But I think there is enough evidence to indicate this. From Aceh all the way over to Flores, from one end of the archipelago to another, this is the pattern you find. of prisoners being taken out, put into trucks, and massacred. And this is where you can kill, where the Indonesian military was able to kill very large numbers of people in a relatively quick amount of time. Okay. So another painting that I use in the book, this comes out in black and white, and it's a bit blurry in the book. I mean, I have to commend UW Press for its work on the visuals. They did their best with the quality of images that I had. But the problem here, I think, was the transfer from the color to the black and white. But this is also an image of the painter, Misbah Kamran, was also a political prisoner who witnessed people being taken out. And this was, again, the image of the truck in the background. I can leave it pointed here. The truck in the background. Here, this soldier has a little piece of paper calling out names. And then these are the political prisoners. And this man's name has been called, and his son is saying goodbye to him, knowing that he is going to be killed, that he is going to be executed. So this was a case then of, it's not just killings. Killings is actually kind of a euphemism. These were disappearances, because they were put on a truck, taken out, and there's no records left. That paper there, we don't have any paper like that. We know that there must have been a paper, or at least one sheet of paper, involved in these things, because the term that was used for this process was called de bon. Bon is a kind of receipt. But that was the term that the political prisoners used. He was orang itu de bon. He was taken out, and because there was some kind of paper involved, the records don't exist, and so we have been left then with a great deal of confusion about what happened, because we don't have the records. And you should never underestimate the ability of a scholar to venture grand claims on the basis of very little evidence, okay? That is what you've had for decades when it comes to the killings. And it's a common explanation that you get is the Santri versus Abangan and so forth. And I'm not going to go into a critique of that, but I'll just say it's really off base. And partly because one clear reason is that these are army organized massacres. Prisoners are being taken out at night, and usually at night, and being disappeared. And so I began this study with the idea that in order to make any progress in trying to figure out what happened, you need to begin with individual massacres. Scholars have been talking about this as one big event, as the mass killings, without getting into the inside this sort of black box, and trying to figure out what is actually going on. That I figure we have to try to get into as much empirical detail as you can. There's a book by Jacques Semelin, Purify and Destroy, within this Genocide Studies literature that I found particularly useful. And he's beginning with this idea too, that is, if you're going to study genocide, think about genocide as a grouping of massacres. Begin by studying individual massacres. And I think the problem in the study of these killings has been the lack of attention to individual massacres. And in Buried Histories, I have one study of one detailed study of one massacre in Bali, and then I have these regional studies that are looking at a number of different massacres, again with as close of attention as I can to the specific empirical details for these other regions, and these are not really the regions where the killings were necessarily the worst. If I had to design the research now, I would choose East Java and North Sumatra to study. those were areas where clearly there were many tens of thousands of people killed. But partly the choice was determined by the ex-political prisoners that we were working with. That is, it was in Surakarta and in Bali where the researchers that Ayu and I were working with, where we had the best relationship with the ex-political prisoners who were conducting their own investigations, who were concerned about this issue, who wanted to push the issue, who were helping us. And I did have information about other regions, including East Java and North Sumatra, but it just wasn't the same level of confidence that I had in writing about those cases. So I wound up choosing these cases. So the field of genocide studies has long recognized the killings of 1965-66 in Indonesia as a case of genocide. They haven't had any problem with it because they've defined genocide in a different way than the 1948 convention. So the genocide studies people have been approaching this not as an international law matter, but as a matter for the social sciences, for the humanities, and so they didn't have any problem with it. And so all of these books, and people started studying genocide from a social science angle from the 1950s onward, but the takeoff is really in the 1980s. And these are some of the key foundational texts. A journal, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, begins in the 80s. So this is the key decade for genocide studies. The earliest writer in this vein was Horowitz, and he mentioned this case of Indonesia, and he was noting that it hasn't been seen as a genocide by the broader public when it should be. He mentioned it in passing. He didn't. But Leo Cooper, in his sort of classic, what became a textbook on genocide, had a number of pages on the Indonesian case, working from information from Amnesty International, as well as Harold Crouch's book. And he's too, so this is a case of genocide. It's just because it's a political group that's been targeted, it doesn't fit the UN definition. And Cooper wanted to stick with that UN definition. But he was saying, really, this is a genocide. So I'm going to call it genocidal massacres. That was his term for it. And then later writers as well, the sort of key book by, this is from 1990, Chalk and Jonasan wrote about it as a genocide. They said clearly this is a group being targeted as a group for elimination. They're being killed not by what they've done, but who they are. This fits the definition of genocide, except for the fact that it's a political group. And the political groups was something that was eliminated in one of the UN commissions that drafted the convention that was passed in 1948. So it's been a case in genocide studies, but as Alex Hinton put it, it's been a peripheral case. It hasn't been like the Rwanda or Cambodia or the Holocaust, Armenian cases that are the kind of core cases for genocide studies. And partly I think that is the lack of information about this particular case, where scholars haven't felt that they've been able to write much about it. The secondary literature about the massacres is very thin. So I have some problems, though, using the term genocide for it. That is, I don't have any problem seeing it as a genocide in the way genocide studies defines genocide. In that way, it's clearly a genocide. But as I will describe in a little bit, I do see some problems with the term genocide, which make me wary of prioritizing the term, that term, to describe what happened. So one is that the idea of genocide is by now, it's become understood as the crime of crimes. It's created a hierarchy of crimes that is the worst crime ever, and that all these other crimes against humanity, torture, disappearances, are lesser, some form lesser. And it creates a really strange dynamic where even victims groups are campaigning to have their experience recognized as a genocide. To some extent that's true for Indonesia, but it's not as important in the Indonesian case as it is in some other cases. And it creates that idea. It's like, is this as bad as a genocide? Is it that bad that we can call it a genocide? And you notice that the term has been rather unworkable, and there's very few cases that have actually been tried as genocide. The Cambodian case, when it came before the UN, the extraordinary chambers that tried the Khmer Rouge, did not charge them with genocide for the mass death. They charged them with genocide for minority groups that had been targeted. But they said this didn't fit the UN definition, and as international lawyers, they had to follow the UN definition, not the Genocide Studies definition. So it's actually not that sort of practical a charge to make. And something that a new book by Dirk Moses has emphasized, called The Problems of Genocide, that by focusing on genocide, we often exclude other really just as devastating forms of mass death, like military operations, counterinsurgency operations, aerial bombing, that kill also hundreds of thousands of people, but are just not considered genocide because genocide is seen as something disconnected from war. So that's another problem. The other thing is just focusing on the issue of group destruction gets us into a lot of problems, and this is why it's been difficult to charge people with genocide, is because you have to prove intent, you have to prove that there was a targeting of the group, you have to think about whether the proportion of the number of victims was, sort of rises to the level of genocide. So there's a range of issues there that just by posing an issue of groupness to define the crime creates problems. But anyway, I'm okay with calling it a genocide in sort of the broad way that Genocide Studies has described it. I'm just going to say that I don't think it actually captures some of the key points of what happened. In Buried Histories, I do engage with the Genocide Studies literature. And I mentioned Jacques Semeline's book before. And Semeline is also very good, I think, on this idea of the perpetrator subjectivity. I mean, you really have to have a very different kind of consciousness on the part of these perpetrators to be able to do what they did, because they have to see, in this Indonesian case, tied up captives. Many of them, they're tied, the common form is for their thumbs to be tied behind their back, being led out and killed and buried in a mass grave. People understood that as an atrocity, okay? Indonesians are no different than anybody else. They see that and they know this is wrong, but they have to have something that the perpetrators themselves who did it had to have something to say, no, this is correct, this is right. And not just because they're following orders, that is the case too, but there's also some kind of justification that they had for it. And then the other issue, which again I think Semeline is one of the few people to prioritize this issue, is the resistance to the genocide. The way in which people did think, this is wrong, I'm not going to go along with this. That is an important theme. We often get so caught up in looking at the commission of the genocide. We pay attention to the perpetrators, and we sort of want to prove that it happened, and we pay attention to the victims and their stories. But there's all these other stories from bystanders and sort of would-be perpetrators, and from the victims themselves on how they resisted. And so the issue of resistance is important. And perpetrator subjectivity, briefly, I was looking at largely, one, through the media, and I sort of punished myself. This is something you have to do as a historian, is read a lot of documents you really don't like to read. I went through every page of these army or military newspapers from October 65 to March 66, and just cataloged all the articles, and so I have a chapter in the book about that. And I think the argument I'm making is that the media was important for shaping the subjectivity of the perpetrators, but by itself it did not cause the genocide. A lot of historians have gotten caught up with, spent a lot of time on this propaganda because this is what's available. It's sort of like the old joke about, so a guy is looking for keys under a lamppost, and somebody comes along and says, "Oh, you're looking for your keys? They're around here." And he said, "No, I lost them over there." I said, "Why are you looking here?" "Because this is where the light is." And this is sort of a problem. We've been focusing on the media. The newspapers are available. We have access to them. But really, this isn't telling us a lot. I'm seeing this more as helping to shape perpetrator subjectivity, but it's really it's not the cause of it. The media reached every part of Indonesia, but not every part of Indonesia saw massacres of captives. And then I have a chapter on torture as well as the production of truth. And this is, in the book, I have a photo of the outside of this door. This is the inside in 2011 after it had been sort of cleaned up. It was kind of a really messy. The first time my colleagues found it in 2007, I first visited it in 2011. And this was a center of interrogations for prisoners in Jakarta, to some extent the whole country. And this is where the top military interrogators were torturing people and trying to get them to tell them about who's in the party and what they're doing, who else could be arrested. And we interviewed people who had been held in this interrogation center, and I see it as not torture, not as extraction of information, but as the imposition of information. That is, they got the prisoners to say what the fantasy was, and then these interrogation transcripts became empirical proof that was used by the military. They pointed to the interrogation transcripts and said, "Here, this is it." The information gets funneled up to bureaucracy, and bureaucracies lose the sense of what is real and what is not. So the propaganda line becomes sort of confirmed. And the resistance, I mentioned, he's the army commander for Bali. This photo didn't get into the book because the quality isn't very good, but it was actually from the Presidential Guard magazine. They had some funding because they were Guard Sukarno. They had their own magazine. And for interest of time, I'm just going to move through this rather quickly. I do pose this question, I think it's an important question, as to the nature of the resistance of the victims. And you can see from the pattern of the killing that when there are extractions from detention camps of prisoners by the truckload, there's very little the prisoners can do to resist. That is, if they do try to resist, they will be shot. So in The Look of Silence, Joshua Oppenheimer's film, there's a story of one man who was being led to the river, and he was able to get out of line, and he survived. Another man who escaped was Romley, who's the son of the family that is the center of the film, but he was found later and killed later in the plantation, on the grounds of the plantation. But this other man escaped and wasn't found. So these small acts of resistance were possible, just escape, but rare, and those who did escape were determined not to reveal that. It was only, and that man was, you could tell in the film, was very wary about being there and having his story being identified. But when they were attacked by mobs, they would resist. But when the police and the military came, they would say, okay, this is official, we're going to be processed, we have some guarantees. Because of the mob attacks, many of them willingly put themselves into custody. And then they were just selected for being executed. So, but this is where I want to end it. And so I think I'm on time here, on track. That is, if we're calling this genocide, something that we miss is the special logic of disappearances. So disappearances I don't like having being relegated to being just crimes against humanity. That is, there's something really atrocious about disappearances because you have families and communities not knowing what happened to their loved ones, and they don't know whether they should hold a funeral for them or whether they should keep looking. There are many families, many women, many widows, who spent years looking for their husbands, many daughters and sons looking for their fathers, going to prisons all around the country, hoping that maybe they'd been sent to Buru Island, that they were part of that group. There was that kind of torture just isn't captured by genocide. That is, in the Buried Histories, I'm emphasizing disappearances. I don't think it's been captured by calling it mass killings or mass murder or genocide. I think the special nature of disappearances should be emphasized. And there is a convention that was passed in 2010 against a UN convention like the Genocide Convention that was passed in 2010. And that is something that we can refer to. And it's very specific. We don't have to get into a lot of debates about whether this is genocide or not, whether the group is being defined in such a way, or whether the intention, or we don't have to deal with the complexities of that definition. It's clear these were disappearances. There's lots of evidence for that, lots of stories from all over the country. We need to focus on these as disappearances. That was my principle. I emphasize torture as well because that's another kind of clear kind of crimes against humanity. There's a UN convention against torture. It's something also that's more definable and concrete. The other thing that I don't think genocide grasped is this issue of the economics of genocide and the way in which we need to narrate this Indonesian case within a story of global capitalism and how important it was to the Suharto regime itself to eliminate the PKI in order to please the United States and gain aid and foreign investment from the United States. The way it was able to then build a kind of economic growth celebrated by the Berkeley Mafia after 1965. I ended one of the, I'll skip this part. In 2019, I went to Palembang and visited an island where a lot of political prisoners starved to death in 1966. And it's now a tourist site, and there's no trace at all of the death that occurred there. And just across the river are the oil refineries. It used to be Shell is the immediate one. In the distance, it was Stanvac. And these were the two major oil refineries for all of Indonesia, going back decades. And the barges with oil and other commodities going up and down the Musi River. And they're sailing over the skeletons of the prisoners who died on this island. This is the kind of story of economic growth that I think needs to be told. And when we call it a genocide, and we look at the Genocide Studies literature, this is not very much about capitalism. That seems to be a completely different universe. But in this case, to understand these killings, I think we need to insert it within a narrative of a devaluation of lives and disappearances. So the disappearances are particularly, this is sort of what I was getting at before. So I'll end there, I'm over time, so thank you very much for listening.